This is Joseph Attard interviewing Christopher Snowdon for rightcasino.com. How are you doing, Chris?
Very well, thanks. Yes, good to be here.
You too. Thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. We're going to rattle off a few topics today, so hopefully it'll be very enlightening. Let's start with a little bit about you. So, obviously, you're an author, journalist, and political commentator. And in general, your writing kind of implies an ideological commitment to social and economic libertarianism. And you've been a vocal opponent of what you describe as a nanny state in Britain and elsewhere. For the sake of our users, would you mind expanding on these views a little bit and telling us a little about your career?
Yeah, I'm mainly focused in my work, my research, and my books on what you call nanny state issues. We call them lifestyle economic issues, because they look at these attempts to improve people's health or improve people's morals by looking at the costs and benefits. What you get with campaigners, whether it's gambling or anti-smoking or anti-alcohol or whatever it may be, obesity at the moment, of course, is a big one, is they look at an issue and say, well, if we do X, Y, and Z, we can improve this situation somewhat, or at least we might improve it, and so we might as well give it a go. They rarely look at the costs of this, often because they don't see the benefits that people are enjoying from drinking or smoking or what have you in the first place. So we try to bring a more rounded view of these issues and say, well, actually, what are the problems here with the black market? What are the problems here with, you're hurting the poor by charging more money? What are the issues, so we can come to a more informed policy decision about some of these controversial products?
So you'd say that your position isn't so much anti-interventionist as it is attempting to find a more rounded picture of how certain industries might best benefit the consumer and protect the health of consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I come at it from a more liberal point of view than often the government, and certainly often more than campaigners do. I mean, I believe basically that people should be free to get on and live their lives as they see fit, but I don't have a problem with the kind of nudge approach if taken literally rather than kind of distorted as it often is. And I don't have a problem with people having to pay for their externalities. So if there are genuine externalities to do with alcohol, for example, I think it's appropriate that alcohol be taxed to cover those costs. But again, often the cost of things to the NHS or to society is enormously exaggerated.
So you've been highly critical, in general, of government intervention in so-called vice industries, such as you mentioned, fast food, tobacco, and gambling as well. Would you mind giving us a sort of executive summary of your attitudes towards the UK's treatment of, in particular, the gambling sector in terms of regulation and taxation? What's your general feeling towards it?
Well, I'm always surprised at what a taboo gambling still is to many people. I mean, I see it, of all the things I talk about, smoking, drinking, and gambling, I guess possibly obesity is slightly less taboo, but that's debatable. But I've always seen gambling as being something that used to have a sort of ring of shame around it, but I thought we got over that some years ago. But when you see these issues come up with casino regulation, nearly 10 years ago, and with the fixed odds betting terminals now, you see that actually a lot of people have quite strong moral objections to gambling.
Sure.
And they do believe in the attitude of the mid-20th century, where even quite liberal people believed that gambling was something to be tolerated, but it should never really be condoned. People shouldn't really be making any money out of it. It certainly shouldn't be advertised, and you should try and contain it as much as you can. So I think that the gambling industry has had a hard time over years. I think that the Blair government did try to improve things, and in some respects they did improve things. But casinos in particular have been given a really bad deal because of the suddenly hastily repatched version of the Gambling Act that came in 2005. All this panic about so-called super casinos led to much needed reform of the casino laws not happening. In fact, you just have, in some instances, some really ludicrous laws. And everybody knows that the casino is the safest place to gamble, as they call it. But the UK is currently very understocked with them. I mean, I'm here down near Brighton, There's a couple of casinos in Brighton, but if I go north, I won't get to another one until I'm in South London.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the general clustering of our most valuable industries in London has been impacting us on multiple levels, but casinos, as always, get a hard time. We'll sort of come back to the issues of FLBTs and the 2005 Gambling Act you mentioned a bit later on. I was just wondering, I was chatting to Dr. Mark Griffiths the other week, and obviously he's quite an important authority on gambling psychology, and the industry in general. And he pointed out that if you were to ask the majority of Britons, are you a gambler, do you gamble, they'd probably say no. But then you ask them, well, do you play the lottery? And they say yes. So obviously there's kind of discrepancy between certain gambling activities and products being accepted and others not. Do you think this is adequately reflected in the way that they're regulated and taxed, or is there an imbalance?
To be honest, I think it is fairly well reflected in regulation.
Okay.
I mean, I think there is a difference between soft gambling and hard gambling. There's some forms of gambling you can lose an enormous amount of money quite quickly. I know people say that you could put £100,000 on a horse, but I mean, very few people do that. Very few people spend £100,000 on lottery tickets or scratch cards. So you can have people addicted to scratch cards, and some people are, without a doubt. But it's a matter of limited levels of potential harm with these products. So I think, the lottery is rightly seen as being at the bottom end of the scale, and casinos and hard gambling are seen at the top end of the scale. And that is really reflected in the regulatory pyramid. There's clearly a lot more regulation of casinos than there is of the lottery, and in my opinion, there's too much for casinos. But generally, it follows a fairly logical ladder. The question about the fixed odds betting terminals, of course, is that you're bringing what have traditionally been seen as hard gambling casino games into bookmakers. And I don't have a problem with that, but I can see why some people think that it's somewhat anomalous to have machines where you can play £100 a stake when the other machines aren't like that, and otherwise you would have to go to a casino or, of course, online to do it.
I suppose the only other instance where there's a slight discrepancy or imbalance, at least off the top of my head, would be bingo halls. I mean, I suppose you read a bet worth taking, the reevaluation of the Gambling Act by the Leisure and Media Committee, and they requested that bingo, as a sort of a low-frequency, low-stake gambling product, have its fairly steep taxation levels reduced in accordance with the fact that it's a soft gambling product, but the government just outright said no. Basically, we're making too much money from taxing bingo halls, so we're not going to reduce taxation, even though we recognise that it's much less harmful than other practices that are more heavily taxed. So I suppose there are still imbalances that need to be addressed.
Yeah, that is true. I think that all gambling should be taxed at the same rate. I don't see.
Interesting.
I don't see taxation as being a way of reducing harm to people. If anything, it just means they spend more money. This is always the case, really, with sin taxes. I think there should certainly be a level playing field with taxation, but I do think there should be different levels of regulation in terms of access.
So what sort of regulation do you envision? I mean, and would it come from the government, or would it come from the gambling industry, or from someone completely different, an independent body?
I think a lot of the good regulation actually does come from the gambling industry, and I think that the recent code for bookmakers was a good example of the gambling industry regulating itself, albeit under the point of a gun, really. Sensible stuff. The kind of regulation I see as sensible, basically, is I don't think you should be allowed to open a casino anywhere, for example. I think there should be far more licenses, or rather, there should be far more scope for opening casinos in places where there is demand than there is at the moment. But the principle of being able to sell a lottery ticket in any shop, but you having to go through the triple lock of regulation to open a casino, seems to me to not be unreasonable.
So I'm looking forward to your answer to this question. How would you characterise the representation of gambling in the mainstream British media?
Oh, it's appalling, generally. and like I say, it goes back to my surprise at how repelled some people still are about gambling, even, as you say, even if they actually gamble themselves on the lottery, as most people do. So if you look at, the Guardian, the Independent, sometimes the Mirror, although often the Mirror is actually more pro-gambling than most other papers, look really at any of the coverage that surrounded the 2005 Act. It wasn't just the Mail attacking the Labour government. Pretty much every newspaper got on board that there was going to be a mafia-run Las Vegas-style super casinos in every town in Britain, and this was just never going to happen. And partly because of that coverage, there weren't any super casinos, which I think is a real shame. I think Blackpool would have benefited from it, and it was a mistake to give it to Manchester in the first place. So
Dr. Mark Griffiths would like to hear you say that. Dr. Mark Griffiths would be appalled to hear you say that.
Oh, really? He's against super casinos, is he?
No, not at all. He was just on the committee that recommended that Manchester get the first one. He was very proud of that bid. He was
really.
Yeah.
Did he say what his motivations were for giving it to Manchester?
Actually, I slightly misconstrued that. He was in charge of the committee that put the bid to the body that allocated the super casino. So he was in charge of making Manchester's case, basically.
Oh, right.
And he was very proud of that bid. And I believe the criteria which ultimately resulted in Manchester winning the bid was it was seen that Manchester would benefit the most, more or less, in terms of economic regeneration, in terms of generating employment, and it had the best infrastructure for a casino, this kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, working out what the economic multiplier is from something like casinos is notoriously difficult. I mean, he may be right, I don't know. But it seemed to me that Blackpool was in much greater need of it than Manchester, because Blackpool really is struggling these days. It desperately needs regeneration. Manchester doesn't. Manchester's already had quite a bit of regeneration. I think it would have been great for the area. People in Britain generally, even if they don't go to Blackpool anymore, have sort of fond memories of it, I think, generally, particularly in the northwest. It needed something to get it going. And and also all the majority of MPs were behind it being in Blackpool. And one of the reasons there was less resistance than there could have been in Parliament was because people felt it was a way of getting Blackpool going. So I thought that was a mistake. But there shouldn't have been a limit of one anyway. They should have, the seaside towns in Britain all need a bit of help, to be honest. As I say, we've got 2 casinos in Brighton, used to have 3, one closed down. And why not? I think Bognor Regis is very keen on having one at the moment. It would, I'm sure, benefit from it, but these ridiculous restrictions of a committee deciding who needs a casino and who doesn't means that they can't have one. Whereas Leeds has got an extra license and have already got 4, I think. So it's ludicrous regulation.
Yeah, it is rather bizarre in some respects. I think the second super casino, I think there's only two super casinos, regional casinos, whatever you call them, in the UK. And it was the first one, Aspers in Stratford, near us, and one in Milton Keynes as well, which I think is also in Aspers. So
see, super casinos, as was intended. I mean, there are no licenses for the big resort casinos.
Yeah.
And very few of the bigger casinos have been built and probably never will.
Yeah,
We've got 16 licenses potentially from the Act, and the reality is that it would be amazing if even half of them get built.
You've commented pretty extensively on the controversy surrounding fixed odd betting terminals. I mean, this is all over the papers, and once again, we're seeing it like a broken record. Every headline, FOBTs, the crack cocaine of gambling, and you actually sort of borrowed that moniker for a kind of a post which went on the IEA, where you talk about the representation of FOBTs, the potential harms of FOBTs. So before we get into more detail, I just wondered if you could reiterate for anybody watching your general feelings towards FOBTs and the whole controversy surrounding them.
Well, I don't really have a strong view on the FOBTs because, I mean, I've tried to work with empirical evidence wherever possible, and there really isn't any in the case of FOBTs. So what my report for the IA was about last year was really looking at the claims made against them and seeing when they could be tested empirically if they stood up. And really none of them did. The crack cocaine and gambling tag, it's amusing to go back and see where that came from. It's kind of 30 years old and it's been applied to every form of gambling under the sun.
Yeah.
So it's just a it's just a slogan that gamblers, that's anti-gambling organisations use all the time, and the media goes along with it. The other claims are things like, it's led to a proliferation of betting shops. It hasn't. Number of bookies has risen from an all-time low by about less than 5%. The all-time low was in 2000. There are far, far fewer bookies than there were in the 1970s, or even most of the 90s. The claim about addiction is obviously the core claim, and this is obviously implied by the crack cocaine idea, and that really can't be. It can't be proven one way or the other, or at least it hasn't done so far. All we've got is a whole load of anecdotes, and it's very easy to get anecdotes about any form of gambling whatsoever. And also, there's no acknowledgement really of the unintended consequences in terms of people just doing the same thing online. Now, I don't have the answers to. I'm not going to sit here and say that fixed odds bet terminals are fine. They're no worse than any other form of gambling. They may be for some reason. It's just that I don't like organisations going out there, very well funded, lobbying government, using arguments that really don't stand up at all. So I'm glad that the government has commissioned some research into it. I look forward to reading it when it's published later this year. But the plural of anecdote isn't evidence. And at the moment, we've got a very motivated, but very small organisation, Campaign for Fairer Gambling, who, for whatever reason, are running a major crusade against these machines. And I really think we should wait for some evidence.
When we were chatting with Dr. Griffiths, he obviously specialises in addiction. He's not anti-gambling in the slightest by his own admission. I mean, as I say, he was part of the organisation that put together a bid for Manchester to receive a super casino. He argued, you were talking about difficulty of ascertaining the addictiveness of particular gambling practices, and he basically said that his team, his researchers, use 6 specific criteria to identify addiction. Boiling it down to gambling, basically the factor which most powerfully motivates addiction is event frequency. So it's the speed at which you can bet something, or the speed at which something happens. And as you say, I mean, online in particular, I mean, you think about online slot machines, there are thousands of possible permutations and thousands of opportunities to win per spin. So those kinds of games in those terms are quite addictive. But I suppose the question with the FOBTs isn't so much about addiction, at least if you have some evidence. Obviously, the evidence for their relative addictiveness is a bit of a complex point. You could certainly argue, though, that they stimulate problem gambling, problem being different from addiction because of the relatively high amount that you can bet in a relatively short space of time. I mean, problem gambling to be a problem, it just has to negatively impact your life. So could you argue that, albeit misinformed, the real issue surrounding FOBTs isn't that they're addictive or seductive, but that they stimulate problem gambling?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, to be honest, the question around fixed odds betting terminals has been turned into a question about addiction because that has been portrayed by its opponents, and that's how the media routinely portray it, with this very dubious statistic that problem gambling has increased by 50% or whatever in the last few years, which again doesn't really stand up. Yeah, I mean, I think I take your point on Mark Griffiths' point. I do agree with him on most issues. I tend to incline towards the opinion that if you're looking to prevent addiction, or you're looking to reduce the amount of gambling addiction in a society, you're on a lost cause, because people either have that part of their personality or they don't. It's the same with alcohol. Most people drink. As a fairly small minority are dependent drinkers or alcoholics. So it's a question then of reducing the harm for that small minority. And that's where the balancing act comes in, because you have less than 1% of the population are problem gamblers by any sensible definition. And, a lot of people who are not problem gamblers are playing these machines and enjoying them. And they can't go to a casino a lot of the time to play the same games because there aren't any. And going online to play them doesn't seem to me to be an improvement on going to a bookmaker's or anywhere else to play them. So, it's a matter of reducing harm, preventing excessive harm to problem gamblers while respecting the rights of the majority of people. And I generally tend to believe in protecting the rights of the majority, because you could just go on forever trying to protect the rights or prevent harm to the small minority. And never forget that they are causing harm to themselves at the end of the day. And to be quite frank, I think I have as much sympathy for a so-called gambling addict as I do to a heroin addict or an alcoholic, because there just isn't that physiological difference there that's really compelling. So I do sympathise to some extent, but I don't think it should be equated with addiction to substances. So, to try and answer your question, speed of play comes up a lot as being one of the issues. It's just that's how long it takes to spin a ball around on a computer. I mean, if you extended it, you would be doing so unnaturally, and it would become less enjoyable and more boring for the people who don't require the government's protection in this issue. You can lower the stakes. I mean, that's the other thing. And I'm not opposed to the idea of lowering the stakes. The £100 stake is purely arbitrary. It's done because £2 would just be not worth playing, because there's just not the excitement there. You need to have a significant prize to win, not £4, or whatever it would be. I mean, it still wouldn't be a great deal, even if you're playing single numbers. So, yeah, I mean, we can have a discussion about what the stake should be, but I would like to know if that's going to make any difference. Yeah, another thing that Mark Griffiths says, which I agree with him about, is that problem gamblers really only see their cash as being tokens with which to buy more time on the machine.
Yeah,
so we can talk about, would it be better if the maximum stake was £5 or £10 or £20, but that would only be worth doing if it's going to make a difference. If the problem gambler's just going to sit there for a bit longer and lose the same amount of money, I don't see how that is useful. It's just going to annoy the admittedly fairly small number of people who want to be playing for £50 or £100 a spin.
I just want to pick up on a couple of those points. So you talk about you have relatively less sympathy for a gambling addict versus a substance abuser or substance addict, because there isn't the physiological elements. But you also said that gambling, the capacity to become a gambling addict is innate. So does that not imply there is a physiological element? I mean, there's been evidence to suggest that there is a gene which corresponds to compulsive action, and that's something which is no fault of the person who suffers as a result of addiction. That's an accident of birth. Isn't that worth sympathy?
Well, as I said, I do sympathise to some extent, just not to the same extent as somebody who is going to get delirium tremens if they stop doing this. And there is obviously an element of willpower in all these kinds of addiction, and I think that should be better recognised. I think the problem I have with certain problem gamblers, the ones who go on to become politically active, is this: if you're trying to stop gambling and you've got a problem with it, the first thing that you have to do is accept responsibility for your actions. And what people who are campaigning against these machines or any form of gambling, having gone through the process of losing a lot of money and doing all sorts of terrible things, stealing from people and so on, if they're going to then blame the government or blame the bookmakers or blame the casino owners, they're not taking that basic first step, which is to take responsibility first and foremost for the fact that nobody compelled you to do any of what you've done. And if you're a heavy drinker, and as a result of being an alcoholic, you beat your wife and you drink drive, you wouldn't expect any sympathy from that. But problem gamblers, for some reason, some of them, I'm only talking, of course, about a small minority of the ones who are prepared to go on television and complain about the industry. Problem gamblers seem to think it's perfectly all right to say, yeah, I used to steal from my mother and so on, and I'm the victim. Well, I'm sorry, you're not the victim. You are the villain. And a compulsion to gamble, which many people would see as being very selfish and self-indulgent, is not an excuse for that. So I take a fairly firm line on it all round. I do take your point that there may be some sort of genetic element, but it's a genetic element that many other people have and manage to control, as people do with alcohol.
Talk for a minute, not so much about the sympathy for the gamblers who inflict these harms, but a kind of pragmatic recognition of the damage that their addiction or compulsive behaviour causes. I mean, sympathy for the victims, sympathy for the mother who has 50 quid taken out of her purse. if the industry recognises that certain gambling practices are resulting in more harms associated with compulsive or addictive gamblers, then surely it has a responsibility to protect the rest of us. I mean, the same way that brands that sell alcoholic beverages, their primary responsibility, in my view, shouldn't necessarily be to the drinker. It should be to everybody who isn't drinking, because they're the ones who suffer from the lager louts, who suffer from people who steal to sustain their drinking habits. On a purely pragmatic level, doesn't the industry have a responsibility to us?
Well, I don't know if I accept the premise of the question, because you again seem to be assuming that it's the industry's fault that people are doing these things. You know, I don't blame people who manufacture knives for stabbings in London. And it is ultimately down to the individual about what they do. You know, we mustn't forget that the person who steals or the person who is violent when drunk is the culprit. Mm-hmm. And there's no getting away from that. Now, if there's things that industry can do or the government can do to industry, which will in some way mitigate the possibility of mitigate those harms or reduce the possibility of them occurring without significantly impeding the rights of the vast majority of people who drink or gamble or what have you, without these problems, then all the better. Unfortunately, there's only a limited range of things that regulation can do, which is going to have that effect. And very quickly, you get to the point where you start taking what I call the neo-prohibitionist route, which is to gradually ban things and tax them ultimately out of existence. So that's a problem. But I 100% don't agree with the idea that it's the producer's fault for people doing things that may harm themselves or may lead to that person harming other people. It is 100% the consumer of those products, with or without any genetic effects or what have you. You know, there's a genetic effect for people being psychopaths. It doesn't mitigate their crimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, our website's called Right Casino. I'm very much not anti-gambling, and I don't think that the majority responsibility should fall at the feet of the gambling industry in the way that a lot of anti-gambling pundits seem to think. I think it's more, and my point was more, as you mentioned previously, some of the best regulation comes from the industry itself. So I'm not so much saying that we should place culpability for the actions of addicts and compulsive players at the foot of the industry. I'm saying that they're in the best position to protect the rest of us from people who, as you say, a very small minority, who lose themselves to compulsive play. It's not that it's their fault, it's just that they can most effectively protect consumers against that outcome.
Yeah, that may well be true. But, you know, I mean, there's this implication, I'm not saying you're making this implication, but there's a suggestion in a whole range of nanny state issues that it's time to do something, we must act and so on, without actually looking at the level of regulation that we're already under. Mm-hmm. I mean, gambling in Britain is really only coming out of a period of complete prohibition. It was only in 1961, I think, when bookmakers were legalized, and even then, in a very, very highly regulated manner. Casinos weren't legal until the early 1960s either. So we're emerging from a period of prohibition, and we haven't had a great deal of deregulation. The fixed odd betting terminals and the abolition of the 24-hour rule are really the only significant pieces of liberalisation since about 1968. So the idea that we're currently in a free-for-all and we must start cracking down on this, I think, is wrong. And I think that the real issue is that we have, in some areas, regulation that is too oppressive and tight and unnecessary. I think casinos are a prime example of that. I think bookmakers at the moment are in a fairly good situation. But I've got to go back to the online world. The online world really does blow the whole idea that you could have 1960s style regulation in gambling.
Well, I'm really glad you brought it up, because that's exactly where we're going to go next. So specifically with Launchpad of talking about the FOBT controversy, you mentioned in a few of your writings that overregulation of, for instance, FOBTs might push users to, into online gambling, which is less heavily regulated. So first of all, I suppose to kind of, you know, predicate this conversation, what is your view of the impact of online gambling on government regulation? I mean, does it completely change everything? Does it make everything else which has ever been done to regulate the gambling industry look redundant and ridiculous?
Well, I mean, I haven't yet done any serious research about the online world. It's, I think, virtually impossible to regulate to any significant degree. I mean, the respectable companies, particularly the ones based in Britain, are going to, fairly well regulated and quite well self-regulated. But there's no doubt that there is a sort of wild west of online gambling out there, which can't be stopped any more than you can stop anything else on the internet. I mean, the porn industry, for example, is completely unregulated and never will be regulated on the internet. So bearing that in mind, if people can play slot machines for £1,000 a spin on their mobile phone on their way to work, I think that we need to bear that in mind when we have the rest of the regulation, because from the government's point of view, you are at least getting tax and significant tax revenue from bingo halls, bookies, casinos, and that's going to go away if people are playing these types of games online. So I know at the moment the government is making more and more effort to try and get some tax revenue.
Yeah, point of consumption tax should come in this year, I think.
Yeah.
End of Q1, I think.
Exactly, and one of the big incentives, of course, for companies paying tax in Britain is that they can advertise. So it comes back to unintended consequences. There's plenty of people think there are far too many gambling adverts and it should be banned. But if you ban it, then they'll just go to the Bahamas or what have you. You know, so there's always consequences from actions. I don't think there's any point trying to regulate online gambling particularly. That doesn't mean I think that high street gambling should play by exactly the same rules. But it does mean if you see evidence of people shifting to online for games that they could quite legitimately play on a high street, including, I mean, especially perhaps blackjack and roulette and fixed odds betting terminals, then you should accept that and try and get people in a reasonably regulated environment where they're paying tax, and not just leave them on the internet where they play for unlimited stakes, completely unregulated, 24 hours a day.
So if the online world is the kind of, frontier west of the gambling market, first of all, do you see that as a dangerous presence? Is that something which, you say that we can't do too much about it by its very nature, but is that something which you would recommend to gamblers, that you should avoid playing online? Keep it at home, perhaps?
Well, yeah, I mean, my views are really the same as the government. It's that there is a regulatory pyramid, and at the moment, online's not in it, and probably never will be in it. So, like the government, I'd rather have people gamble in regulated environments than in unregulated ones. Now, that doesn't mean I'm demonizing the online world. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with online gambling, and I think most of the online gambling sites are very well regulated or self-regulated. People playing poker online, I see, is a perfectly healthy thing. The effect it has on problem gamblers, I think, is another area where there needs to be a bit more research. And again, I'd be interested in it. But in a way, where does that research leave you policy-wise? Because there really isn't a great deal that can be done about it.
So once again, I guess the answer has to come from the industry itself.
Has to come from the industry?
Yes.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think if there is an answer to this, it is to encourage people to play on regulated websites from, countries like the UK, or especially the UK, because I really don't think there is a major problem with the online gambling world, from your Ladbrokes and Hills and Party Poker. I think potentially there is a problem with some of the other websites. But as there's nothing you can do about them, I think the only sensible thing is to encourage people to use the respectable ones, which basically are the ones that advertise.
Well, obviously we've seen significant issues with the online gambling industry ourselves, which is why we started this website, to help people instantly and easily locate safe, secure websites with proper licensing that are independently audited. We think that the solution for the online gambling market is a matter of transparency. It's about every brand being upfront about what they provide, being upfront about payouts, about their regulation, about their licensing. That's really our objective, and we think that's where the future of online should be.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It would be good. This may already happen for all I know. I don't really gamble online, but it would be good to have some sort of stamp of approval, if you like, awarded by some kind of independent but probably industry-funded body, so that people know where they are. Some sort of online gambling kite mark.
That's what we offer, right? Casino mark.
I didn't know that, so I'm glad I've sort of I've sort of unintentionally supported your work.
Oh well, we're delighted. Obviously, thank you very much. So, data from the Gambling Commission, and this is quite a thorny topic, which has been quite heavily publicised, suggests that gambling losses are almost exactly inversely proportional in the UK to income levels. So, if this data is accurate and the people who gamble the most have the lowest incomes, surely somebody's failing somewhere. There has to be some kind of error being committed by somebody, or is it purely a matter of responsibility for the individual?
I don't know if it's an error. I mean, you see this kind of inverse socioeconomic gradient with a lot of things. You see it particularly with smoking, where you've got the wealthiest people have a smoking prevalence of 10%. People on the lowest incomes have a smoking prevalence of about 35%. You have homeless people have a smoking prevalence of 90%. So these kind of vices, if you like, are not price sensitive in the way that you would expect. It's really got nothing to do with affordability. Now, a lot of people would say it's down to education, and there may be some truth in that. Some people would say there's an element of reverse causation in here. That if you're spending a huge amount of money on cigarettes and gambling, then you are, by definition, going to be poor. None of this is helped, of course, by extremely regressive sin taxes on these kind of products. So there is an argument for saying that if the government wants to reduce the regressive nature of any of these products and limit what used to be called secondary poverty. It's not a phrase that's used very much these days, secondary poverty, but it's basically people who wouldn't be poor unless they were spending their money on various unnecessary products. And then there's the sociological, psychological aspect of it, which is that smoking, drinking, and gambling have always been particularly associated with working class people and people on lower incomes, and there are perfectly valid sort of economic, if you like, economics in the broadest sense, economic reasons for that, which really just come down to if your life is not all that enjoyable, then you're going to seek out temporary and possibly unhealthy and possibly even immoral pleasures, and it's always been this way. So I don't think anyone's failing anybody. I think it's really the way it's always been, and is actually justifiable to some extent if you look at people's social circumstances. The best way to reduce these problems, if they are problems, is economic growth, make people richer.
Sure, but richer or not, there's always going to be social economic gradients, and chances are it'll always reflect inversely the level of consumption for, if you like, vice products, although like you, I don't really enjoy that term. So is there really nothing that can be done beyond saying if we all get richer, then we won't have so much of a problem? Because the way I see it, whether or not general wealth increases, there's always going to be that gradient. So surely that's not going to solve the problem.
Well, there will always be inequalities like that. But I don't think inequality itself is associated with these problems, which is to say if you have greater inequality, you have more of these problems. I do think that wealth and education are the main factors. But I think you need to accept, these things will always go on and not see them as a problem necessarily. And ultimately, accept that people have a right to choose. The fact that people on lower incomes might smoke more doesn't necessarily suggest that they're being manipulated or that industry is somehow, for some reason, targeting poor people. One of the things about the fixed odds betting terminal moral panic is that there's all this outrage about the number of FOBTs in low-income areas. Well, for one thing, there have always been more bookmakers in low-income areas because dog racing and horse racing have always been more popular with the working class. And the other thing is, what is the implication here? That the betting industry have deliberately gone out to target people in low-income areas. I mean, as business plans go, it doesn't really make any sense. The obvious explanation for it is that's where the demand is. The bookmakers aren't creating demand. It's very difficult to create demand, in fact. The fact of the matter is that people in those areas, often immigrant communities who come from countries such as China, where there's much more of a gambling tradition anyway, they are responding to the demand. That's really all there was to it. If they could persuade people or manipulate people into playing these machines, then they would clearly have more of a motivation to open them in the middle of Chelsea rather than the middle of Tottenham.
Yeah, of course. Again, the question isn't so much that the industry is going out to, setting out to make people poorer or target poorer people. As you say, that wouldn't even make business sense, let alone, be morally justifiable. I guess the argument's more that by going with the money is, whether or not that makes sense from a business perspective, it is perpetuating what some would describe as a problem. And I guess my question is there anything the industry can do to mitigate that?
I think the short answer is no.
Okay.
I think the slightly longer answer is that the government shouldn't be doing it anyway. I think it's slightly patronising to say, well, this is more concentrated amongst people on low incomes, so we need to address it because they can't think for themselves, and they're just pawns in the game, or they're too ignorant. I mean, it may be that there's a higher rate of ignorance about risk and statistics and odds in that area, which of course should be dealt with by education. And I'm not one of these people who says about every problem, well, there needs to be more education, but I do think that some sort of course in school about probability, odds, statistics, epidemiology, these kind of things will be useful not just for gambling but for all sorts of things in modern life. H.G. Wells said about 100 years ago that a time would come where an understanding of statistics would be essential for modern life, and I think that time has actually come, whether it's from understanding the risks of sugar, to take a topical example.
Indeed. Red meat,
yeah, any of these things, understand the difference between relative risk and absolute risk, or just understanding what your odds are in a bookmaker's playing anything, really, but particularly if it's betting terminals. I mean, it is a very well-used cliche that gambling is a mug's game, that the house always wins, but it certainly is true, the house will always win. And if people don't believe that, or they don't understand why that is, that's a problem. Gambling is fundamentally an entertainment pursuit that, like most entertainment pursuits, you need to hand over hard cash for, one way or the other. And the way you hand it over in gambling is less predictable, and the amount you're going to be handing over is equally less predictable, and sometimes you don't hand it over at all. Sometimes you get it handed to you, but it still needs to be seen as an entertainment product. Gambling at the end of the day is a form of entertainment, and like most forms of entertainment, you need to pay for it. You will be handing over money, and in gambling, the way you hand over the money is rather different to going to the cinema. Firstly, you don't know how much you're going to hand over. Secondly, sometimes you get handed the money. And thirdly, you don't know how much you're going to be handing over or receiving in either case. But the reality is that most of the time, in the long term, you will be handing money over. And therefore, it needs to be seen as an entertainment that the house will always win. Therefore, don't do it too much. And the longer you spend playing, the more you're going to lose. So treat it as a form of entertainment. Because it's obviously not a way to make money, and there are very few forms of gambling where people actually make a living from it, and certainly roulette isn't one of them.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's about time we wrap this up. So finally, you've argued that, and I'm quoting you here, so if it sounds familiar, that's why. Better regulation of the domestic gambling industry should focus on providing greater flexibility, new technology, and larger stakes for venues which are higher up the regulatory pyramid. Do you ever see this scenario coming to pass in Britain, or are we already there?
Well, we're not already there, and I think I was mainly talking about casinos and that quote, I think.
Yes, you were, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the casino industry is, in my opinion, the main part of the industry that needs liberalisation. It was widely acknowledged in the early 2000s that the rules that the casino had to follow were very archaic, they were anachronistic, and they reflected the problems of casino gambling in the 1960s when there was a free-for-all and it was very heavily associated with organised crime. Everybody knew that was the case in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And one of the main reasons I think that the Gambling Act came along was to address that. And unfortunately, we had a moral panic to do with the so-called Las Vegas super casinos, that the baby got thrown out with the bathwater. And there is simply not the right provision. There's not the right spacing out of casinos around the country. There are not enough places where people can gamble at the casino. That needs to be changed. There also needs to be change in terms of how many machines casinos can have. It's ludicrous to limit them to the extent that they have. And in a way, I can see the casinos' complaints, if assuming they have a complaint about the bookmakers having all these fixed odds betting terminals when they can have so few. The casino is at the top of the pyramid. It should be allowed to provide, in my opinion, pretty much unlimited gambling. You know where you're going. You know what you're going to get if you walk into a casino. Lower down the ladder, you've got the bingo halls and the bookies, which are pretty well regulated. Down all the way down to the lottery, which is, you only have to be 16 to buy a ticket. You can buy them pretty much anywhere. The online world is half outside that pyramid, really, and that is the elephant in the room in terms of regulation. I would like to see the gambling industry regulated. I don't really see any areas where I think that there is under-regulation at the moment. I think that the move should all be in the direction of liberalisation, and I think it will happen eventually. But unfortunately, the issues around the super casinos in particular are so toxic that I don't see politicians wanting to revisit this anytime soon, except possibly to clamp down on fixed odds betting terminals.
I might add a quick addendum there, actually. So, you could argue, I suppose, that if you go on to an online casino in the same way, you know exactly what you're getting. You know exactly that you're on that website to gamble. So, do you think that online gambling is almost an ideal scenario? I mean, it's virtually unregulated, as you say, except for a lot of brands in this country who are independently audited, and throughout Europe, actually. So, does the online market have it right? Is that where we should be?
I don't think so, really. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not in the least bit opposed to online gambling. I think it actually fills a gap that has been created by excessive regulation. But I guess the advantage of being in a casino over being online is that there are some checks and balances. You will be thrown out if you are drunk. At some point, if you're losing heavily or looking particularly, across or irrational, there's a good chance that somebody will come over and have a word. So there are sort of harm reduction policies in place, particularly in casinos that recognise the fact that there is hard gambling taking place. That doesn't happen online. From an empirical point of view, there needs to be more research done into, is there more damage being caused to problem gamblers by themselves online than in casinos? I don't know what the answer to that is, but it seems to me that it would be a shame if gambling moved over entirely into the online world.
Okay, well, true. I mean, no one's going to serve you a martini when you're playing online.
Exactly, yeah. And it's more sociable as well. Gambling at the end of the day is, as I said before, it's a form of entertainment. And there should be a social element to it a lot of the time. And casinos really do provide that with the live music, the drinks, and generally the conviviality, which you get also in bingo halls, to a lesser extent in bookies, but they are also community hubs as well a lot of the time, and you don't get it at all really online. So I think to end, I would just stress the fact that everybody, from the industry to the gambling opponents to politicians to the users, must always bear in mind this is a form of entertainment, and it costs money, but it is part of the entertainment business, and should be encouraged as part of the entertainment business, even if it's not for everybody.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Chris. That was really, really, really interesting, and we really appreciate you turning up for the interview. This is Joseph Attard interviewing, once again, Chris Snowdon for rightcasino.com. Thanks very much, Chris.